Hi everybody, it's Van Molyneux from Free Domain Radio. This is a presentation on nature or nurture, an examination of identity. I hope you will find this very helpful. I think it's essential. Why are we even looking at this stuff? Well, if you want to change the world, then you have to change people's minds. It's very, very fundamental. And if you want to change people's minds, you have to know how the mind is formed, how beliefs, how opinions, how perspectives, how habits come into existence. And if you want to solve social problems, crime, abuse, dysfunction, and addiction, and so on, you got to learn the biology of how they come about. It's not the final full answer, but it is an essential step in changing the world. So there's a lot of debate at the moment about genetics versus environment, and I'm going to suggest that there's a third way that's supported by science. So there's considered to be two influences, of course. The first is your genes, that they're fixed, that they're inherited, and they kind of determine how you're going to turn out in many ways. And then, of course, there's your environment. Alterable, it's not inherited, and is obviously open to a lot more change than genes. So the gold standard of trying to tease out these two complexities is identical twins who have 100% genetic similarity, and particularly if they're separated shortly after birth and raised in different environments, then similarities would be assumed to be something to do with the genetic makeup. Of course, fraternal twins have a 50% genetic similarity, but they share the same womb at the same time. And siblings, of course, they have a 50% genetic similarity like the fraternal twins, but they don't share the same womb at the same time. And so, of course, if you've got twins separated at birth, raised in disparate environments, then similarities would appear to be more to do with genetics than environment. But let's have a look and see. So these two poles of understanding human nature, genetics and environment, are really not very helpful, I would argue, or at least the science would argue, and you'll find references for all its material at the end of the presentation. Genes are not fixed at birth. They're not fixed at conception. They are switched on and off by the environment. This is called epigenetics. Really, really worth looking into if you really want to change the world, or at least have a happier time understanding how the world is the way it is, or why it is the way it is. Genes are not fixed, but they vary according to experience, as does the mind, which is very, very important as well. And this is for pre-birth and post-birth. So, of course, after conception, but before birth, there is a huge amount of genetic information or genetic predispositions or genes that are switched on and off based upon the environment within the womb. And we'll get to why this is important later. But who we are genetically is not fixed by the marrying of the DNA from mother and father. There is potential there, but genes are activated or deactivated according to experience. Chemical experience, stress experience, the womb experience, the nutritional experiences, all of these switch on and off genes and actually form the brain. So genes are really potentiality. The actuality, what is actually manifested, is through experience. So let's look at the brain. Okay, so the infant's brain has way more neurons, synaptic potential, and dendrites than it actually needs. This is very, very important. We're born with this massive potential grid, but how it's hooked up is variable on experience. So experience helps to determine which neurons are going to persist, which synapses are going to develop and become permanent, and which connections will take prominence or be subdued. And so really the brain is shaped largely, and some estimates go as high as 90%, the brain is shaped by experience. Again, experience goes from conception all the way to actually the third decade of life. This is still occurring in your 20s. Myelination, the formation of the protective sheath surrounding nerve fibers, continues throughout childhood and in some areas the brain into the third decade of life, as mentioned. This process, as it goes on, establishes final permanent linkages within the brain structures. And I mean, I'm often asked as if I'm any kind of expert. I'm just a gatherer of information and a rebroadcaster. But I'm asked, so is this stuff permanent? Well, of course, neuroplasticity helps us remember that the brain can rewire itself. If you are willing to do the self-work, if you're willing to do therapy, if you're willing to change your habits. But the real challenge, of course, is that if the mind is broken, it is the mind itself which is broken that has to decide to heal itself, and that can be a real challenge. So let's look at the gold standard. So you got twin studies. Identical twins are separated at birth and brought up in different families. Neither family is the biological one. So here the similarities got to be genetic and the differences are environmental. And there is a significant degree of correlation in similarities between twins raised in separate environments. So it's really, really important to discuss that. So if two members of such a twin pair live in different families and they have different environments, different experiences, then of course they continue to have the same genes. It follows that similarities must be dictated by genes and similarities by their rearing environment. And this is how people attempt to tease this stuff out. Not quite so simple. So of course the twin studies are supposed to minimize environment. This supposes of course a tabula rasa at birth. Right? The womb experience, the fetal development experience is not considered to be that important if you focus on twin studies and the similarities arising from genetics after birth. We'll get into this. And the science really does strongly oppose this. So for instance, maternal stress has powerful effects on genetic fetal development. Maternal stress has powerful effects on genetic fetal development. This is hugely, hugely important. I mean, imagine you're a mom and you've got twins growing in your belly and you're going to give them up for adoption. Well, clearly you're in a stressful situation already. You're in a high-stress situation. Something's not right in your life. You're too young, you're in an abusive relationship, you're unmarried, you're broke, something is causing you to have such a high degree of stress that you are going to give your children up for adoption. That is going to have a huge effect on how the twins develop within your womb. Now, they're separated after birth, and if one of them goes, let's say, to a high-stress, one of them goes to a low-stress family, they still had the first 9 months in the womb being affected by maternal stress hormones, and we'll go into the science of this in a moment. So let's also look at this. One of the studies has shown that it is the father's alcoholism that is the most strongest correlation to drinking, alcoholism in the offspring. Well, how could that be? Well, people assume that the genetic predisposition to alcoholism is passed along through the father's gene towards the children. But maternal stress has been linked to higher rates of alcoholism. And gosh, imagine that you are a mother-to-be, you're pregnant with a child, and your father, so the father of the child, your husband or partner, is an alcoholic. You've got stress, you've got chaos. Maybe you really have doubts about the child, having the child. You may be experiencing abuse. Alcoholism is incredibly dysfunctional. And intimate partner violence, aggression, or abuse is incredibly correlated to the stress of the mother-to-be. And this has an effect on the susceptibility to alcoholism. This is really, really important. It's not the direct genetic pass-through that occurs. It's the stress that creates it. So, for example, you got rat pups weaned from their mothers at 2 weeks of age, and they have, as adults, a greater propensity to drink alcohol than pups weaned just a week later at 3 weeks of age. Right? So I understand that none of this is all completely conclusive and it's all 100% environment, but this does throw at least, I think, some reasonable doubt on the genetic transmission of personality characteristics, particularly around dysfunction. Let's have another look at the twin studies. So twins takes a lot of variables out of the situation that aren't specifically genetic. So twins have the same gender, they have the same inherited tendencies, and they have identical physical features. And fraternal twins may, of course, be a different gender, different looks, and so on. And this is really, really important. The environmental response to people who have the same physical characteristics and, to some degree, personality characteristics. And again, we're not talking about somebody has a slightly sunnier disposition than someone else. So that's not particularly relevant when it comes to solving social problems. What we're really looking for is functionality versus dysfunctionality, healthy relationships versus abusive relationships, a functional relationship to your environment versus an addictive relationship to your environment. And so if identical twins are going into different families, there is still going to be a very strong similarity of reaction because they look the same and they have similar characteristics. So imagine, let's take for example, so you've got two girls, are twins, separated at birth, adopted in different families. They both become models. Well, if they're both beautiful, then they're both going to become models if they want. And the world is going to react to them in a particular way because they're beautiful. I mean, that's just a physical characteristic that is going to have a response from the world around it that's going to be the same, at least similar. So these, again, it's really hard to just say genetics. So let's look at the adoption studies a little bit more. Adoption studies in and of themselves cannot decide questions of genetic inheritance. So as we mentioned, any woman who has to give up her baby is by definition a very stressed woman, and this is going to have an effect on the brain development and particularly the development of the emotional regulation systems within the fetus, within the child. Parenting styles are often inherited epigenetically. They're passed along biologically, but not through DNA transmission from parent to child. So a mother who is stressed is going to bathe the child in cortisol involuntarily. Cortisol is going to have an effect on the development of emotional self-regulation, or the lack of development of emotional self-regulation in the fetus and child, and therefore the child is going to have particular characteristics that result from that: a lack of capacity to self-soothe, a greater propensity for addictive behavior, and so on. But it's not DNA that is passing this along, it is the behavior and emotional habits of the parents. To look a little bit more into environment. So Gabor Mate, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, is a very, very important book to read in this area. So our in utero, infantile, and early childhood development, according to Gabor Mate, he's actually been on this show if you want to check it out. They are the most important biological factor in determining whether or not a person will be predisposed to substance dependence and to addictive behaviors of any sort, whether drug-related or not. This is very, very important. If we're looking to solve social problems, one of the main things we need to be able to solve is addictive behavior, whether it's addiction to drugs or to sex or criminality, violence, abuse, rape, murder, and also political power, as we will look at later in the presentation. Political power is roughly as addictive as cocaine, and that's one of the reasons why people seek to get it and to continue to expand it. So the human brain's very different than most mammalian brains. It really, really develops under the influence of the environment. This has huge implications for politics, statism, and criminality. If the human brain and particularly dysfunction within the human mind develops under the influence of the environment, then if we change the environment, we will change the way people think, or their capacity to think, really, more accurately. So let's look at the development. So, pick a horse. A horse can run in the first day or two of life. Human beings don't get really around to that until about 2 years of age. So the reason for this is we've got this, not just me, but others as well, we've got this giant head. And the giant head has to pass through the lady's hoo-hoo. And it can't be too big, otherwise it's going to be, basically playing Make-A-Wish with the lady's legs. And so we have to be born prematurely. Our brain is born way too early. They would much rather develop within the womb, but they can't because they're getting too big. And so this is one of the reasons why the brain continues to develop in such a fundamental way, after birth, for the first couple of years of life, because really it's a very immature brain relative to other mammals. It's born, the first year of life has really been called the fourth trimester, right? Because this is why infants are so, they need their moms so much. They need that physical intimacy because they are really being born prematurely relative to their development. So this is, let's start to get into dysfunction, and we'll get into the causes of this. So drug abuse is incredibly correlated to childhood abuse. Gabor Mate, who's worked as a physician in the downtown east side of Vancouver for many years, one of the highest concentration of drug addicts in the world, he says that all of his female drug addicts were sexually abused or raped as children, all of them. And this is really, really important, and we'll sort of get into why. Right? Some people try cocaine and they don't get addicted. Other people do try cocaine and then become addicted, and there's very strong physiological reasons for this to do with the environment that they were raised in. But, of course, the war on drugs is the war on the victims of child abuse. It's one of the reasons why it's so criminal in so many levels. We're punishing people for having been abused and attempting to self-medicate that abuse. Unbelievably tragic. So, early traumas are almost a universal association when one speaks of addiction. The adverse childhood experiences, ACE studies, are well known, and they show a high positive correlation between trauma and addiction and other mental health issues and psychophysiological disorders. We'll get into that a little bit more. This is run by Dr. Vincent Felitti, who's also been this show. You can check out fdrurl.com/BIB to look at the Bomb in the Brain series that I've done. So we got to start looking at dopamine, the happy, happy, joy, joy juice of the brain. It is an essential life chemical. If you don't have dopamine in the brain, you actually won't live. They are the feel-good, reward, pleasure, and pain relief chemicals. It's the runner's high. It's the joy you get from achieving a goal. It is a sexuality. It is hunger and food and satiation and so on. So it is an incredibly essential, motivating characteristic of the brain. The love chemicals and so on, the attachments and intimacy and passion and joy and all of these kinds of things. They've done studies where they've deprived mice in a laboratory of dopamine, they just starve to death because they have no incentive to eat. Even though they may be hungry, even though their life is dangerous, even though they're wasting away, they won't eat because they got no motivation or incentive. That's really, really important to understand. Dopamine dysfunction is heavily related to trauma, stress, violence, and abuse within childhood, and of course in the womb environment. So the dopamine circuitry in addicts doesn't function very well. Remember, it's the circuitry of incentive and motivation, and this doesn't function very well at all, right? So the dopamine is at the base, and then there's a whole circuitry of incentive and motivation that involves the chemical dopamine. None of these function very well in addicts. And stimulant drugs like cocaine and crystal meth, nicotine and caffeine all elevate dopamine levels in the brain, as does sexual acting out, extreme sports, workaholism, and so on. So a lot of these extreme behaviors, pathological behaviors, violent behaviors, addictive behaviors, are an attempt to stimulate the brain into elevating dopamine levels so that people feel close to normal. And this is one of the reasons why some people get addicted to certain substances and others don't. If you've got a happiness level of kind of 100, you have cocaine, it goes to 200, you crash back down to 100. But if you start with 20 and you go to 120, you don't go back down to 100, you go back down to 20. And then you realize what you've been missing, and you have to get back to the drug just to feel close to normal. And this is really, really important to understand. You're not going to get addicted to pain meds if you don't have a pre-existing pain condition. But if you have a pre-existing pain condition that you really don't notice until you take the pain meds, oh my God, this is what it's like to feel normal, you can't go back to that pain. You're suddenly really aware of it, really conscious of it. And so you're going to want that drug again, just so you can feel normal, as opposed to, it's not a high, it's an average that a lot of these people are getting to. So around ADHD and medicating children, the assumption, of course, and there's a massive increase in the drugging of children with these psychotropic drugs. And the assumption, again, this is according to Dr. Maté, is that we're dealing with a genetic disorder, right, a chemical imbalance and so on, and the only way to deal with it is pharmacologically. But if you actually look at how the dopamine levels in the brain develop, this is not the case. It is not a genetic disorder. So if you look at infant monkeys, you measure their dopamine levels, they're normal when they're with their mothers. If you separate them from their mothers, the dopamine levels go down within 2 or 3 days. And think of the US, where you have maternity leaves of 12 weeks, a couple of months. If the children, remember, you're still, in a sense, in the womb in the first year of life, or you should be, first year or two, really. And that's why children need such close proximate intimacy with their mothers. You separate them, the dopamine levels begin to decline. This sets the stage for addiction, for reaching a level of normalcy back with some drug that elevates dopamine levels. And again, Maté says, the conditions in which children develop have been so corrupted and troubled over the last several decades that the template for normal brain development is no longer present for many, many kids. And he associates this with the massive increase in childhood dysfunction. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who's a professor of psychiatry at the University of Boston, says that the neglect or abuse of children is the #1 public health concern in the United States. For what it's worth, I concur. Okay, so let's just start looking at some of the development aspects here. The human brain does not develop on its own according to some genetic program. It depends enormously, overwhelmingly on the environment. The essential condition for the physiological development of the brain circuits that regulate human behavior, right? Neofrontal cortex, the one that says, wait, what are the consequences of this behavior? What's going to happen in the long run if I pursue this? The essential condition for the physiological development of the brain circuits that regulate human behavior, that give us empathy, that give us a social sense, that give us a connection with other people, connection with ourselves, that allows us to mature, the essential condition for these circuits, for their physiological development, is the presence of emotionally available, consistently available, non-stressed, attuned parenting caregivers. It's why in this show, for years and years, I have pounded the drum of improved parenting is an improved world. And some examples, right, so of when this is really breaking down, where parents are stressed, parents are absent, parents are distant, parents are abusive. There are many, many more autistic kids in this country now. So 20-fold increase in the last 30 years, a 20-fold increase. The rates of anxiety amongst children is increasing. The numbers of kids on antidepressants has increased tremendously. The number of kids being diagnosed with bipolar disorder has gone up enormously. We've got behavioral issues, bullying, precocious and premature sexuality, teenage pregnancies. All of this results from the disintegration of childhood and the resulting effects on the capacity for the brain to emotionally self-regulate, on the dopamine centers of the brain. I mean, here's a little example. So in Windsor, Ontario, it's an automating town, sort of the twin city of Detroit. In 2009, the number of visits for childhood mental disorders went up 50%, a huge amount of economic uncertainty. So the parents become more stressed, and the children are diagnosed with more mental health disorders. Clearly, this is not genetic because it's occurring at a time of adult stress. So let's look at some of these addictive behaviors. You've got over-gambling, over-shopping, hyper-compulsive sex, over-spending, over-saving, shoplifting for the thrill, overeating, overuse of pornography, over-exercising, workaholism, of course, drug use, and so on. But I'm going to include, and it's not many experts do this too, they include criminality under addiction, right? So the more socially destructive behavioral addictions or compulsions, serial rape, pedophilia, torture, murder, spousal beatings, violence of every kind, parental abuse of children, and so on. And so the simplistic answer to the question of choice, of addiction, why is somebody addicted to something else, to something as opposed to something else? So the dopamine sites in the brain have become flooded with the performance of the addict's favorite behavioral act out, right? So if you go and beat someone up, you are elevating the dopamine levels within your brain. And this is a way of trying to feel normal. But again, this is according to some experts, the ultimate and final explanation is that the particular act out is chosen because it is a symbol of the major emotional deficiencies or traumas experienced during the addict's early life. You cannot understand the adult addict without understanding the trauma of the early life and the resulting brain chemistry dysfunction that comes out of that. And act out, of course, is, we think it just means bad behavior, but acting out technically refers to exhibiting a behavior because you don't have the words to describe what happened. And typically this has to do with early childhood experiences. So you'll hear, of course, in the mainstream media, which is always correct, you will hear that, oh, we found the alcoholism, oh, we found the smoking gene, and so on. There's a one-to-one relation between a gene and a specific behavior. There's an obesity gene, a personality gene, and so on. And the researchers are, at least as far as I've been able to tell, unanimous. Even those who are running these studies, there is no such thing as a gene for alcoholism. There's no such thing as a gene for obesity or a gene for a particular type of personality. Got to understand how genes and behavioral traits are connected. So the authors of an influential twin alcoholism study, they lean themselves strongly towards genetic interpretations, wrote that at this point we are not certain that anything is inherited. Two children with similar predispositions will not automatically develop the same way. Once more, the environment is decisive. This should give us great hope for improving the world. Here's a study that is one of the most oft-quoted and perhaps the most influential study, quote, proving a genetic cause for alcoholism. This is really important. Now we understand the prenatal and the postnatal development of how stress and abuse and neglect and all of this stuff, how that influences the capacity for the child to self-regulate. So children are born without the capacity to emotionally self-regulate. They learn that through being comforted by the parents. If that's not available, they do not have the capacity to self-regulate stress and anxiety. Thus, they're going to be much more drawn to self-medication, to external elements and substances and behaviors that is going to manage their own stress and anxiety because they have not internalized the caring parent alter ego. So, in this study where they found that there was a correlation between genetic similarity and alcoholism, well, these two twins, adopted children, stayed with their parents of origin for up to 3 years, right? So you've got 9 months of development in the womb in a very stressful environment, an alcoholic family, and then you've got up to 3 years of brain development in that same stressful environment. You separate kids after that, well, of course you're going to find a correlation between, quote, genetics and alcoholism, but it's going to be related to the environment, the womb and the post-womb environment. The mean age of adoption in this study was 8 months. Right, so that's 17 months, 9 plus 8, yeah, 17 months of brain development that occurs before these. This is not genetic at this point. More than enough time for the environment to have a very powerful effect. So, of course, we all know how complex the human mind is, how complex the personality is. Until recently, it was thought there are about 100,000 genes in the human genome. So even if there were 100,000 genes in the human genome, the idea that you could explain the complexity of the human mind with reference to 100,000 genes is obviously ridiculous. But now there are, in fact, only about 30,000 gene sequences in our DNA, even less than in some lowly worms. So, quote from UCLA research psychiatrist Jeffrey Schwartz, "Our DNA is simply too paltry to spell out the wiring diagram for the human brain. Can't pass these characteristics along genetically." So, genes are not autonomous dictators of our destinies. They are controlled by our environment. And without these environmental signals, they can't actually function. Genes are listening to the environment. What kind of world am I being born into? What kind of traits do I need to develop to survive and succeed in this world? Do I need to be violent? Do I need to be cooperative? Do I need to invest in pair bonding to raise my children? Or am I going to just have sex with as many women as possible in the hopes of reproducing that way? What kind of society am I living into? Is it warlike? Is it peaceful? Is it cooperative? Is it aggressive? Genes are listening to the environment from birth onwards. A stressed mom is assumed to be in an environment by the genes. The stressed mom is assumed to be in an environment of want, of violence, of shortages, and therefore you've got to come out punchy. That's how the brain is wired, by reference, by listening. The genes listen to the environment and switch on and off, as do the connections in the brain, very carefully. So researchers from the medical school at Hebrew University, Jerusalem have said, quote, "In the past few decades, it has become increasingly clear that the development and later behavior of an immature organism is not only determined by genetic factors and the postnatal environment, but also by the maternal environment during pregnancy." Stress, of course, is a big one. So numerous studies in both animals and humans have shown that maternal stress or anxiety during pregnancy can lead to a broad range of problems in the offspring, from infantile colic to later learning difficulties and the establishment of behavioral and emotional patterns that increase a person's predilection for addiction. Stress on the mother, as I mentioned earlier, results in higher levels of cortisol reaching the baby, and chronically elevated cortisol is harmful to important brain structures, especially during periods of rapid brain development. A recent British study, for example, found that children whose mothers were stressed during pregnancy are vulnerable to mental and behavioral problems like ADHD, or to being anxious or fearful. Now, ADHD, anxiety, and fear are powerful risk factors for addiction, right? Lower levels of dopamine, you become addicted to something to raise your levels of dopamine to feel normal again. Let's look at aggression. Professor Yvette Glover of Imperial College London found stress caused by rows with, arguments with, or violence by a partner was particularly damaging, according to a BBC report. Quote, "Experts blame high levels of the stress hormone cortisol crossing the placenta. Professor Glover found high cortisol in the amniotic fluid bathing the baby in the womb, and this tallied with the damage done. The study's results are consistent with previous evidence that stress on the mother during pregnancy affects the brain of the infant with long-term and perhaps permanent effects." Now, this is where the father comes in, because the quality of the mom's relationship, or the mom-to-be's relationship with her partner, is often her best protection from stress. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Women who were pregnant at the time of the 9/11 World Trade Center attacks and who suffered post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of witnessing the disaster passed on their stress effects to their newborns. At 1 year of age, these infants had abnormally high levels of the stress hormone cortisol. So, of course, we've talked about a relative scarcity of dopamine receptors, right? They're the plugs, the receivers of the dopamine, also elevates addiction risk. So psychiatric researcher Dr. Bruce Perry says, "We've done work, and a lot of other people have done work, showing that essentially the number and density of dopamine receptors in these receptive areas is determined in utero. So your capacity to receive and process the happy, happy, joy, joy dopamine is determined in utero, which is why, again, you separate twins in birth when the mom's been stressed. Of course, they're going to be dopamine deficient, and thus at a higher risk for self-medication through various dysfunctional behaviors. So, why is there such a strong focus on genetics? Well, I think it's a very interesting question. So, there's a lot of guilt, there's a lot of responsibility if we have done things as a society, as individuals, as parents, that have permanently impaired our children. I mean, that's a horrible thing to contemplate. And if we have a society that is bad for children, and I think our society is incredibly toxic for children, that's really painful to look at. If we can blame genetics, then we don't have to change the world. We don't have to change our own behavior. We don't have to deal with guilt. Genetics, this is a quote, "that neutral, impassive, impersonal handmaiden of nature would absolve us of responsibility and of its ominous shadow guilt. If genetics ruled our fate, we would not need to blame ourselves or anyone else." I mean, this doesn't mean that the genetic argument is false because of that, but it helps to explain why it's so seductive. Louis Menand wrote, quote, "It's all in the genes, an explanation for the way things are that does not threaten the way things are. Why should someone feel unhappy or engage in antisocial behavior when that person is living in the freest, most prosperous nation on earth? It can't be the system. There must be a flaw in the wiring somewhere. If we can make dysfunctional behavior either a choice, in which case we can punish people, which is unjust, or we can make dysfunctional behavior like having blue eyes, something which we can't change, then again, we don't have to deal with change. So to support some of this, according to one recent study, 22% of ADHD symptoms in 8 and 9-year-old children can be directly linked to maternal anxiety during pregnancy. Abused children are far more likely than others to be diagnosed with ADHD, and the same brain structures affected by childhood trauma are most consistently abnormal in the scans of children with ADHD. Now, just to be clear, there is a counter-argument to this which says that ADHD children are born that way and they're abused more often because they're much more difficult to deal with as children. I'll show in a separate presentation I'm going to do either today or tomorrow that the evidence is strongly against this interpretation, that children are born badly wired and they get abused as a result, that the abuse comes first. I mean, imagine if we had a world where the checkup for children at 1 year and 3 years of age was a brain scan to see if there was any evidence of parental neglect or abuse or dysfunction within the household. Intervention, intervention, intervention. You can measure this stuff, measure the levels of cortisol in the mother's system, try and find ways to, I mean, this is how we change the world. Arguing about abstracts with people who have broken brains is, you know, like you're pretending you're in some sort of race car, a race with a clunker that's up on 4 cinder blocks. I mean, you may be doing something in your mind, but just not doing anything in the real world. So stresses or interruptions in the infant-mother relationship lead to permanent alterations in the dopamine systems of the midbrain and prefrontal cortex, disturbances that are implicated in both ADHD and in substance abuse and other addictions and dysfunctional behavior. So, as I mentioned, children are not born with, the infants are not born with the capacity to self-soothe. They get upset and they learn soothing, self-soothing from being soothed by the parent. It just, I mean, children are not born knowing that, you know, this is called a forehead. They have to learn that from their parents. They're born with the capacity for language, but not the content of language. They're born with the capacity to self-soothe, but not the action or the habit of self-soothing. So if the infants get upset and the parents don't respond or they don't respond adequately to their distress, the endorphins are not released to soothe the upset. And the child makes up their own inadequate coping mechanisms. They got a rock or a thumb suck as ways of self-soothing and tuning out, or they tune out, emotionally dissociate to escape their distress. Right? So the endorphins that are released to soothe the child are released by the care and attention and love and concern of the parent. And if the parent is not able, not willing, or not capable of responding in a sympathetic way, then you end up with the situation where the child has to come up with their own crappy, desperate ways of self-soothing, and this puts them at risk, significant risk for addiction later on. So, I am an advocate of a society without a state and without the brutal hierarchy of politics. And why am I talking about this in the realm of addiction? Well, I've made the argument for many years that if people have happy childhoods, they will not seek power over others. And there's lots of science to back this up. I try not to say things completely off the cuff, or if I do, I try to say this is completely off the cuff. So power over others, it changes the brain, it triggers increased testosterone in both men and women. And testosterone, and one of its byproducts, they're addictive because they increase, remember, they increase dopamine in a part of the brain's reward system called the nucleus accumbens. Right? So power is another one of these things that releases or increases dopamine production or reception and makes us feel great. And cocaine has its effects through the system also. So cocaine hijacks the brain's reward system, so it gives short-term extreme pleasure but leads to long-term addiction, and with all that entails. So power and political power, power over others, a hierarchy, climbing up a hierarchy has similar effects to cocaine. So vote Coke. And the converse is true as well. If you lose power and hierarchy, this causes a reduction in the production of dopamine. So submissiveness and dominance have their effects on the same reward circuits of the brain as power and cocaine, right? Submissiveness and dominance are the same as power and cocaine. So if you've got a baboon who's low down in the dominance hierarchy, they have lower levels of dopamine in key brain areas. But if they get promoted to a higher position, then the dopamine rises accordingly. So again, you get a kid who's born traumatized, and just look at the childhood of politicians. I mean, the childhoods of politicians are brutal, brutal. And so they're born with these low, I mean, they have to get political power just to feel vaguely normal. Horrendous how they're treated as children. And so if a baboon is low down, they got low dopamine and are stressed, depressed, and anxious. And then if they go up in the hierarchy, then the dopamine rises accordingly. And this is why, I mean, you see this all the time on the internet, right? People feel bad or down, or they're owned by someone, and so they level up by attacking back. This is an attempt to raise their own dopamine levels by going up in the pecking order. And if you don't see this, the tribal behavior of children, the Lord of the Flies stuff in public school, the bullying, these are all attempts to raise dopamine levels through going up in the hierarchy. Put someone else down, and your own dopamine levels are going to rise up. And if you have a severe deficiency, I guess you really want to be president or some other. I mean, it happens in the private sector as well, but I think in politics it's much more important. So this, when you go up in the hierarchy, it makes you more aggressive and sexually active. And when human beings are given power, similar things happen. Power also makes people smarter. Dopamine improves the functioning of the brain's frontal lobes. When you have higher levels of dopamine, you think better. You're better able to process the consequences of your actions, which is why asking addicts to heal themselves is so tough, because you're asking people with low dopamine levels who are increasingly getting lower dopamine levels through addictive behaviors that, you know, you blast your dopamine receptors with cocaine or crystal meth or something like that, they become, the body stops producing as much dopamine, which is why the addictions have to continue to increase. So you're asking people whose brutalized childhoods and addictive behaviors have caused them to become less intelligent and to be less able to process the consequences of their actions. You're asking these people to make wise decisions, long-term decisions, intelligent decisions, but the lack of dopamine is related to less intelligence, less capacity for higher or executive or cognitive functioning. So when you go down in the hierarchy in society or among baboons, then you get less dopamine, you get more stress and reduced cognitive function. Now, you get too much power, and I don't know if you've noticed the size of government lately, but I think that's just being in government these days. You get too much power, and then too much dopamine can disrupt normal cognition and emotion. It leads to gross errors of judgment and a sense of imperviousness to risk, right? So look at the financial disasters that have occurred recently. I mean, there's lots of legal and political and monetary policy and fiat currency and Federal Reserve issues there as well. But think of how much power people in government have. Think of how much power people at the top of the financial world have. They get too much power. This is why it's so important to restrict the accumulation of power in society. And political hierarchies and the attendant corporate fascistic feeding on those political hierarchies gives people way too much power, and it messes up their brains. It messes up their capacity to think. It interferes with their reasoning abilities, and it impairs their judgment, it impairs their capacity to process risk, and it creates a narcissistic egoism, and it reduces our capacity to have empathy for other people. This is one of the reasons why power corrupts. It's not just some spiritual thing. It is a physical change in the brain that results from an excess of dopamine production. Right? So think of how great someone's decision-making capacity is when they're loaded up on PCP or crystal meth or heroin. They don't make good decisions, but because they have an excess of dopamine in that system. The same thing is true with political power. You give people too much political power, their brains get rewired, their brains change. And this is one of the reasons why people in political power make such consistently bad decisions, underestimate the risk, have a lack of empathy, a lack of capacity to admit fault, a lack of capacity to change course. It's in the brain. So, changing the world, as we said at the beginning, is changing minds. You want to go out and change minds, and I say that a long, painful experience. I've been trying to change people's minds for 30 years. Varying degrees of success. I mean, I do run the biggest philosophy show in the world, 40 million plus downloads. I speak at conferences. I write books. But if you really want to change something, you first have to understand what it is, right? I mean, if you would never try and alter the innards of a house without looking at the innards of a house and drawing out the blueprints and trying to figure out, you know, where the load-bearing walls are and so on. You would never try and change the electrical wiring of a house without looking at what was there already. And so if you want to change people's minds, you have to look at how they're wired already, and you have to look at the limits that you have in trying to change people's minds when they have this fundamental problem, which is, you know, lack of dopamine, addictive behaviors that result from that. Changing your mind is a very difficult and painful thing. And people who have a high susceptibility to pain signals because they lack endorphin production, self-soothing, and so on. Asking someone to change their mind about God or politics or ethics or relationships and so on is highly stressful. And if people already have low dopamine levels and low endorphin levels, then they're not, very unlikely to be able to do that. You're asking a 400-pound chain smoker to come and join Cirque du Soleil and bounce upside down on an elephant and twirl around. I mean, you can ask them, but they're just not going to be able to do it. And this is why I argue that it's a multi-generational process that requires, peaceful, non-violent parenting. This is how we outgrow the existing and traditional hierarchies that we have inherited from even more traumatized times. Understand the mind, and then you can figure out how to change it. Crime, dysfunction, and politics, they're all addictions, and they're all related to each other, right? So if you had better parenting, if you had more peaceful parenting, if you had less stressed mothers and more together families, why then you would have, Gabor Mate estimates 90% of addiction would be wiped out in 2 generations. And so how could you justify a war on drugs if 90% of crime is wiped out? If 90% fewer people want to get involved in politics because they want to raise their dopamine levels, then you're going to have a fundamentally different society. And this is not social engineering. I want to understand that. This is not social engineering. In the 19th century, Chinese women would have their feet bound, right? They were, as children, the feet would be forced back so that the toes ended up growing into the heel. Unbelievably painful and horrible. And it's not social engineering to say, let's stop doing that. Let's stop torturing, warping, and distorting the human body. And it's not social engineering to say, let's stop torturing, warping, and abusing the human mind and let it develop in a healthy, natural way. That is not social engineering. That's letting the mind develop as it should. It's not interfering with its natural development through stress and abuse and all these kinds of things. So I really want to understand that. I'm saying, let's stop breaking people's backs. That's not the same as trying to engineer them to be different, but rather let them be who they are. So thank you so much for your time, effort, and energies. You can go to fdrurl.com/nurturepress, P-R-E-S, for more notes on this. Again, I hope you will check out fdrurl.com/BIB for more information on the physiology of this kind of stuff. And thank you so much for your time, attention, and support. This is a donation show. If you'd like to donate, please go to freedomainradio.com/donate to help out. Have yourselves a great day. I really, really appreciate your time and attention in this most important area.